Excerpt from Petrarch's Secret by Francesco Petrarca, 1304 to 1374. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the first dialogue between Petrarch and St. Augustine. Petrarch. I believe there is a multitude of things for which we ardently long, which we seek for with all our energy, but which nevertheless, however diligent we are, we never have obtained and never shall. St. Augustine. That may be true of other desires, but in regard to that we have now under discussion, the case is wholly different. Petrarch. What makes you say that? St. Augustine. Because every man who desires to be delivered from his misery, provided only he desires sincerely and with all his heart, cannot fail to obtain that which he desires. Petrarch. O Father, what is this I hear? There are few men indeed who do not feel they lack many things, and who would not confess they were so far unhappy. Every one who questions his own heart will acknowledge it is so. By natural consequence, if the fullness of blessing makes man happy, all things he lacks will so far make him unhappy. This burden of unhappiness all men would fain lay down, as every one is aware, but every one is aware also that very few have been able. How many there are who have felt the crushing weight of grief through bodily disease, or the loss of those they loved, or imprisonment, or exile, or hard poverty, or other misfortunes it would take too long to tell over. And yet they who suffer these things have only too often to lament that it is not permitted them, as you suggest, to be set free. To me, then, it seems quite beyond dispute that a multitude of men are unhappy by compulsion and in spite of themselves. St. Augustine. I must take you a long way back, and as one does with the very young whose wits are slight and slow, I must ask you to follow out the thread of my discourse from its very simplest elements. I thought your mind was more advanced, and I had no idea you still needed lessons so childish. Ah, if only you had kept in mind those true and saving maxims of the wise, which you have so often read and re-read with me. If, I must take leave to say, you had but wrought for yourself instead of others, if you had but applied your study of so many volumes to the ruling of your own conduct, instead of to vanity and gaining the empty praise of men, you would not want to retail such low and absurd follies. Petrarch. I know not where you want to take me, but already I am aware of the blush mounting to my brow, and I feel like schoolboys in presence of an angry master. Before they know what they are accused of, they think of many offences of which they are guilty, and at the very first word from the master's lips they are filled with confusion. In like case I too am conscious of my ignorance and of many other faults, and though I perceive not the drift of your admonition, yet as I know almost everything bad may be brought against me, I blush even before you have done speaking. So pray state more clearly what is this biting accusation that you have made. St. Augustine. I shall have many things to lay to your charge presently. Just now, what makes me so indignant is to hear you suppose that any one can become, or can be, unhappy against his will. Petrarch. I might as well spare my blushes, for what more obvious truth than this can possibly be imagined? What man exists so ignorant or so far removed from all contact with the world as not to know that penury, grief, disgrace, illness, death, and other evils too that are reckoned among the greatest, often befall us in spite of ourselves, and never with our own consent? From which it follows, that it is easy enough to know and to detest one's own misery, but not to remove it, so that if the first two steps depend on ourselves, The third is nevertheless in fortune's hand. St. Augustine. When I saw you ashamed, I was ready to give you pardon, but brazen impudence angers me more than air itself. How is it you have forgotten all those wise precepts of philosophy, which declare that no man can be made unhappy by those things you rattle off by name? Now, if it is virtue only that makes the happiness of man, which is demonstrated by Cicero and a whole multitude of weighty reasons, it follows of necessity that nothing is opposed to true happiness except what is also opposed to virtue. This truth you can yourself call to mind, even without a word from me, at least unless your wits are very dull. Petrarch. I remember it quite well. You would have me bear in mind the precepts of the Stoics, which contradict the opinions of the crowd, and are nearer truth than common custom is. St. Augustine. You would indeed be of all men the most miserable were you to try to arrive at the truth through the absurdities of the crowd, or to suppose that under the leadership of blind guides you would reach the light. You must avoid the common beaten track, and set your aspirations higher. Take the way marked by the steps of very few who have gone before, if you would be counted worthy to hear the poet's word. On, brave lad, on, your courage leading you, so only heaven is scaled. Footnote: Aeneid, 9:641. End footnote. Petrarch. Heaven grant I may hear it ere I die. But I pray you to proceed, for I assure you I have by no means become shameless. I do not doubt the Stoics' rules are wiser far than the blunders of the crowd. I await therefore your further counsel. St. Augustine. Since we are agreed on this, that no one can become or be unhappy except through his own fault, what need of more words is there? Petrarch. Just this need, that I think I have seen very many people, and I am one of them, of whom nothing is more distressful than the inability to break the yoke of their faults, though all their life long they make the greatest efforts to do so. Wherefore, even allowing that the maxim of the Stoics holds good, one may yet admit that many people are very unhappy in spite of themselves, yes, and although they lament it and wish they were not, with their whole heart. St. Augustine. We have wandered somewhat from our course, but we are slowly working back to our starting point. Or have you quite forgotten whence we set out? Petrarch. I had begun to lose sight of it, but it is coming back to me now. St. Augustine. What I had set out to do with you was to make clear that the first step in avoiding the distresses of this mortal life and raising the soul to higher things is to practice meditation on death and on man's misery, and that the second is to have a vehement desire and purpose to rise. When these two things were present, I promised a comparatively easy ascent to the goal of our desire, unless haply to you it seems otherwise. Petrarch. I should certainly never venture to affirm this, for from my youth upwards I have had the increasing conviction that if in any matter I was inclined to think differently from yourself, I was certain to be wrong. St. Augustine. We will please waive all compliments, and as I observe you are inclined to admit the truth of my words more out of deference than conviction, pray feel at liberty to say whatever your real judgment suggests. Petrarch. I am still afraid to be found differing, but nevertheless I will make use of the liberty you grant. Not to speak of other men, I call to witness her who has ever been the ruling spirit of my life. You yourself also I call to witness how many times I have pondered over my own misery and over the subject of death, with what floods of tears I have sought to wash away my stains, so that I can scarce speak of it without weeping. Yet hitherto, as you see, all is in vain. This alone leads me to doubt the truth of that proposition you seek to establish, that no man has ever fallen into misery but of his own free will. or remained miserable except of his own accord, the exact opposite of which I have proved in my own sad experience. St. Augustine. That complaint is an old one, and seems likely to prove unending. Though I have already several times stated the truth in vain, I shall not cease to maintain it yet. No man can ever become or can be unhappy unless he so chooses. But as I said at the beginning, there is in men a certain perverse and dangerous inclination to deceive themselves, which is the most deadly thing in life. For if it is true that we rightly fear being taken in by those with whom we live, because our natural habit of trusting them tends to make us unsuspicious, and the pleasantly familiar sound of their voice is apt to put us off our guard, how much rather ought you to fear the deceptions you practice on yourself, where love, influence, familiarity play so large a part, a case wherein every one esteems himself more than he deserves, loves himself more than he ought, and where deceiver and deceived are one and the same person. Petrarch. You have said this kind of thing pretty often today already, but I do not recollect ever practicing such deception on myself, and I hope other people have not deceived me either. St. Augustine. Now at this very moment you are notably deceiving yourself when you boast never to have done such a thing at all. And I have a good enough hope of your own wit and talent to make me think that if you pay close attention you will see for yourself that no man can fall into misery of his own will. For on this point the whole discussion rests. I pray you to think well before answering, and give your closest attention, and be zealous for truth more than for disputation. But then tell me what man in the world was ever forced to sin? For the seers and wise men require that sin must be a voluntary action, and so rigid is their definition that if this voluntariness is absent, then the sin also is not there. But without sin no man is made unhappy, as you agreed to admit a few minutes ago. Petrarch. I perceive that by degrees I am getting away from my proposition, and am being compelled to acknowledge that the beginning of my misery did arise from my own will. I feel it is true in myself, and I conjecture the same to be true of others. Now I beg you on your part to acknowledge a certain truth also. St. Augustine. What is it you wish me to acknowledge? Petrarch. That as it is true no man ever fell involuntarily, so this also is true, that countless numbers of those who thus are voluntarily fallen, nevertheless do not voluntarily remain so. I affirm this confidently of my own self, and I believe that I have received this for my punishment, as I would not stand when I might, so now I cannot rise when I would. St. Augustine. That is indeed a wise and true view to take. Still, as you now confess you were wrong in your first proposition, so, I think, you should own you were wrong in your second. Petrarch. Then you would say there is no distinction between falling and remaining fallen? St. Augustine. No, they are indeed different things, that is to say, different in time. But in the nature of the action, and in the mind of the person concerned, they are one and the same. Petrarch. I see in what knots you entangle me, but the wrestler who wins his victory by a trick is not necessarily the stronger man, though he may be the more practised. St. Augustine. It is truth herself in whose presence we are discoursing. To her, plain simplicity is ever dear, and cunning is hateful. That you may see this beyond all doubt, I will go forward from this point with all the plainness you can desire. Petrarch. You can give me no more welcome news. Tell me then, as it is a question concerning myself, by what line of reasoning you mean to prove I am unhappy. I do not deny that I am, but I deny that it is with my own consent that I remain so, for on the contrary, I feel this to be most hateful and the very opposite of what I wish. but yet I can do nothing except wish. St. Augustine. If only the conditions laid down are observed, I will prove to you that you are misusing words. Petrarch. What conditions do you mean, and how would you have me use words differently? St. Augustine. Our conditions were to lay aside all juggling with terms, and to seek truth in all plain simplicity. And the words I would have you use are these. Instead of saying you cannot, you ought to say you will not. Petrarch. There will be no end then to our discussion, for that is what I never shall confess. I tell you I know, and you yourself are witness, how often I have wished to and yet could not rise. What floods of tears have I shed, and all to no purpose. St. Augustine. Oh yes, I have witnessed many tears, but very little will. Petrarch. Heaven is witness. For indeed I think no man on this earth knows what I have suffered, and how I have longed earnestly to rise, if only I might. St. Augustine. Hush, hush! Heaven and earth will crash in ruin, the stars themselves will fall to hell, and all harmonious nature be divided against itself, sooner than truth, who is our judge, can be deceived. Petrarch. And what do you mean by that? St. Augustine. I mean that your tears have often stung your conscience, but not changed your will. Petrarch. I wonder how many times I must tell you that it is just this impossibility of change which I bewail. St. Augustine. I wonder how many times I must reply that it is want of will, not want of power, which is the trouble. And yet I wonder not that now you find yourself involved in these perplexities, in which in time past I too was tossed about, when I was beginning to contemplate entering upon a new way of life. Footnote: St. Augustine Confessions 8:8. End footnote. I tore my hair, I beat my brow, my fingers I twisted nervously, I bent double and held my knees. I filled the air of heaven with most bitter sighs. I poured out tears like water on every side. Yet nevertheless I remained what I was, and no other, until a deep meditation at last showed me the root of all my misery, and made it plain before my eyes. And then my will after that became fully changed, and my weakness also was changed in that same moment to power, and by a marvellous and most blessed alteration I was transformed instantly, and made another man, another Augustine altogether. The full history of that transformation is known, if I mistake not, to you already in my Confessions. Petrarch. Yes, in truth, I know it well, and never can I forget the story of that health-bringing fig tree, beneath whose shade the miracle took place. St. Augustine. Well, indeed, you may remember it, and no tree to you should be more dear. No, not the myrtle, nor the ivy, nor the laurel beloved of Paulo, and ever afterwards favored by all the bands of poets, favored too by you above all, who alone in your age have been counted worthy to be crowned with its leaves. Yet dearer than these should be to you the memory of that fig tree, for it greets you like some mariner coming into haven after many storms. It holds out to you the path of righteousness, and a sure hope which fadeth not away, that presently the divine forgiveness shall be yours. Petrarch. I would not say one word in contradiction. Go on, I beseech you, with what you have begun. End of Excerpt from Petrarch's Secret by Francesco Petrarca, 1304 to 1374.
Potatoes and War by Helen Mackay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. Potatoes and War by Helen Mackay. From Accidentals, 1917. All morning in the fire zone of Paris the young lieutenant had watched the old woman who was digging potatoes. It was a day of the season of market gardens in the year of desolation. Paris was breached with cannon and burned with petrol. One was growing used to the lightning and thunder of war. The storms of two sieges had kept death so close to Paris and for so long that it had come to be part of life, accepted as of every day and commonplace. There, where the young lieutenant was on picket duty and the old woman was digging potatoes, shells had, for months, been coming and coming again, to blaze black trails through the silver stems of the poplars, or to smoke up the good earth of the fields. In the fields someone was burning brushwood, and the smell of its smoke mingled with the smell of the gunpowder smoke. The two smokes together hung in the mist that lay along the river. It was a misty blue day, and the smoke of cannon made beautiful little sudden white clouds in the soft veiled sunshine. The young lieutenant walked up and down past the rows of the old woman's potatoes, and would have given anything in the world, except the one thing it would have cost him, to be able to get away to where the smell of fields was not all mingled with the smell of war. Once a shell burst so close to the old woman and to him that the broken black hot bits of it were all about them. Then he said to her, almost angrily, "My God, Granny, why don't you get away out of this?" She was a little, thin, doubled up old woman with a face like a nutcracker. One imagined her nose and chin snapping together. She lifted her head and looked at him out of sunken, vague old eyes. "Why don't you get away?" he asked her again. "Why don't you?" she asked him. "I?" he said. I cannot. I must stay." He was so young that he added proudly, "I must do my duty." She said, "Eh, bien, what will you?" "I also must do mine." She went back to her digging of potatoes. End of Potatoes and War by Helen Mackay.
An 1880s sojourn in Saltillo, Mexico. An excerpt from Face to Face with the Mexicans by Fanny Chambers Gooch, 1887. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Saltillo was once also the capital of Texas, when that great state formed an unwilling member of the Mexican Federation. It has a population of about 20,000 and is situated on the Buena Vista tableland in the Sierra Madre Mountains, at an elevation of about 5,500 feet above sea level. It was founded on the 25th of July, 1575, by one Francisco Udignola, who brought with him 60 Tlascalan families who were bitter foes of the Aztecs and firm allies of the conquerors. The city is the seat of important manufactures, both woolen and cotton. Here are made rebozos, a long narrow shawl worn by women over their heads, and also those gorgeous and durable serapes, blankets, of finest wool and most brilliant colors, which have gained so wide a celebrity that the term Mexican blanket is a synonym for a genuine and almost everlasting fabric. It has the usual places for recreation: a bull ring, plaza, an alameda, a cathedral worthy of inspection, also numerous churches with a full quota of schools and colleges. We were a party of Americans on business, health, and pleasure bent. Our company consisted of Mr. and Mrs. R., the former a retired banker from a large Western city; Mr. and Mrs. A., Mrs. S. and daughter, my husband, and self. As the hotel accommodations were meager and uncomfortable, and it not being the custom of the country for families to live in hotels, we concluded to go to housekeeping, as our stay was indefinite and might extend through a few weeks or months. The house selected for our Bohemian abode, we were assured, was almost 100 years old, and had an air of solemn dignity and grandeur about its waning splendor. It was of startling dimensions, capable of quartering a regiment of soldiers with all their equipments. It was 1 story in height, with a handsome orchard and garden in the rear, extensive corrals for horses, the whole extending from street to street through a large square of ground. The distinguishing features of Mexican and Spanish architecture were evident throughout the patio courtyard, with fountain in the center, flat roof, barred windows, and parapet walls. These latter rise often to the height of 6 feet above the main structure, and in times of war and revolution have proved admirable defenses to the besieged. Entrenching themselves behind these walls, passageways are made from one house to the other until the entire block of buildings is one connected fortification. The strife may continue for weeks uninterruptedly, the fusillade not ceasing long enough to remove the dead from the streets. The size and unwieldiness of the front doors were amazing. Noble defenses in time of revolution, it is true, but when with my whole strength I could not move one on its antiquated, squeaking hinges, almost a half yard in length, the question of how to pass from house to street became a serious one. The happy discovery was made at last that instead of 2, there were 4 doors all in one, the 2 smaller ones within the greater serving for our usual ingress and egress. The huge double doors, spacious enough to admit a locomotive with its train of cars, were never opened except on state occasions, or for the admittance of a carriage, buggy, or something out of the ordinary, such as a dozen or so wood-laden donkeys. Not only funerals and bridal parties, but every imaginable household necessity for pleasure or convenience must pass through the front doors. In the zaguan front hall, high up in the cedar beams, darkened by age to the color of mahogany, was this inscription or dedication in large, clear letters: Ave Maria Santissima. In other houses these dedications varied according to taste. One read, Siempre viva en esta casa Nuestra Senora de Guadalupe. May the Virgin Guadalupe always watch over this house. Still another inscription in the house of a friend read, Aquí viva con você, José y Maria. May Joseph and Mary dwell with you here. We were astounded at the size and length of the keys and the number of them. They were about 10 inches long, and a blow from one would have sufficed to fell a man. As there were perhaps 30 of them, my key basket, so far from being the dainty trifle an American woman dangles from one finger in her daily rounds, would have been a load for a burro, as they call their little donkeys. The enormous double doors connecting the rooms were as massive as if each room were intended for a separate fortification. The opening and closing of these heavy doors as they scraped across the floors gave forth a dull, grating sound, which added to the loneliness of our castle. Our venerable mansion was constructed of adobe, the sun-dried brick peculiar to the country, and of which almost the entire city is built. The walls were from 2 to 4 feet in thickness, and the ceilings 30 feet in height. Surrounding the beautiful courtyard were many large and handsome rooms, frescoed in brilliant style, each different from the other. Besides these, there were many smaller apartments, lofts, nooks, and crannies, more than I at first thought I should ever have the courage to explore. The drawing room was the first thing to attract my attention, as it was about 100 feet long and 50 wide. Its dado was highly embellished by a skillful blending of roses and buds in delicate shades, while the frieze was the chaste production of a native artist. The ceiling, as before mentioned, was 30 feet in height, and another source of surprise to me was the discovery that the foundation of all this elaborate workmanship was of the frailest material. These wonderful artisans, in making ceilings that are apparently faultless, use only cheesecloth. After stretching it as tightly as possible and adding a coat of heavy sizing, the beautiful and gorgeous frescoes are laid on, and the eye of an expert cannot detect the difference between a cloth ceiling and the more substantial plaster with which we are familiar in the United States. The floor of this room presented another subject of inquiry as to its materials and the method employed in making it so hard, smooth, and red. Mortar, much the same as is used in plastering, but of a consistency which hardens rapidly, is the basis of operations. On this a coating of fine gravel, very little coarser than sand, is applied. Then comes the final red polish, which completes a floor of unusual coolness and comfort, and admirably adapted to the country. The material used to give the red finish is tipichil, an Indian word, in some places known as almagra, an abundant earthy deposit to be found principally in the arroyos. For ages this substance has been an important article for ornamentation, even the wild tribes of Indians using it to paint their faces and bodies. When the floor is hardened, a force of men is employed who, by rubbing it with stones, produce a beautiful glazed polish. If time were of any value, these floors would cost fabulous sums, as it takes weeks to complete one of them. It required months almost for me to comprehend the manner of cleaning them. The floors of the other rooms were of imported brick and tiles, the former not less than a foot square and perhaps half as thick, while the latter were octagonal and of fine finish, though, like the mansion itself, they bore the evidences of age and decay. We enjoyed the unusual luxury of glass windows, and it was enough to puff us up with inordinate pride to look out and see our neighbors' houses provided with only plain, heavy wooden shutters. When it rained or was cold, however, our ill-fitting windows proved an inadequate protection, and it became necessary to close the ponderous wooden shutters, thus leaving the rooms in total darkness. Our windows were also furnished on the outside with iron rods, similar to those used for jails in the United States, and quite as effective, while those of many of our neighbors had only heavy wooden bars, so close together as scarcely to permit the hand to pass between them. These, I was told by a Mexican lady, were called jealous husbands' windows. In the middle of many of the shutters of some of these houses were tiny doors, whose presence, when closed, would never be suspected. They were just large enough for a face to peer through, and when passing along the street on cold or windy days, hundreds of soft, languishing, dreamy eyes might be seen gazing out of these little windows. In Mexican architecture, the window is second in importance only to the roof itself, for the next thing to be protected from the rain is the necessity for the family to be able to see into the street. The walls are of such thickness that one window will easily accommodate two of their quaint little home manufactured chairs, and as there is no front stoop, each afternoon finds the senoritas seated in these chairs, taking in the full enjoyment of the usual street scenes. The roof, being flat, was constructed in a unique manner, having first heavy wooden beams laid across the top of each room, and then planks coated with pitch placed on these, after which 12 inches of Mother Earth were added, then a coating of gravel, and lastly one of cement, the whole making a roof impervious to rain or heat, and proving the admirable adaptability of Mexican architecture to the climate and the people. The houses in general are provided with roofs of adobe, and some of the plainer ones, in which I became a visitor, when the rainy season was at its height, gave me an amusing insight into the freaks and tricks of the "dobe," as they are familiarly termed. When there were no frescoes on the cheesecloth canvas, it would be taken down periodically, washed, and then replaced as smoothly as a plaster ceiling. But woe betide the 'dobe roof when the rainy season makes its advent. The treacherous mud covering succumbs to the pressure of the driving water, and often the entire room or house is submerged in the twinkling of an eye. Besides the main leaks, numerous little bubble-like projections, like pockets, each filled with water, sagged down the canvas in various places. To my great amusement, I found that my ingenious native friends had always on hand the essentials for stopping the leak, such as an old broom handle or strip of wood, which by the aid of a bent pin and a string, manipulated by dexterous fingers, soon repaired all damages. First, all the little sacks of water are conducted by means of the broom handle into the larger one, where the bent pin has been previously attached to the canvas and also to one end of the string. To the other end the strip of wood is fastened, and under this a bucket placed. 20 minutes from the time of the first onslaught of the torrent through the roof, all is serene and calm as a May morning. Orders were given at once to the mozo to sow the roof with grass seed so as to prevent another catastrophe. No greater protection is found for an ordinary earthen roof than that afforded by a solid greensward. The roots form a compact network, so that it must be an unusually heavy storm that can penetrate it. The method of conducting the water from the roof is in keeping with everything else. Great heavy gargoyles, or stone spouts, weather-beaten and moss-covered, tipped with tin, full 10 feet in length, 6 in a line on either side of the court, answered the purpose in our mansion. During a heavy rainstorm, it was interesting to watch the steady streams of water foaming and surging into the court. I saw a dog knocked senseless to the ground by one of these streams, and it was several minutes before he recovered his breathing and yelping faculties. The ends of these spouts, in many instances artistically ornamented, protrude over the street. In more modern houses, conduits, a few inches wide, are cut into the sides of the wall and cemented, taking the place of the stone spouts. They are quite as effective, but the quaintness and antique appearance of the houses is greatly diminished by them. In the carriage house there still remained a silent old relic of Mexican grandeur and aristocratic distinction, with wheels like an American road wagon and hubs like a water bucket. In the garden were fruit trees and the family pila bath. The latter was built of adobe, 3 feet high and 12 feet square, without cover, the water being supplied by means of earthen pipes from the mountain springs. A fountain and exquisite flowers adorned the patio, a climbing rose of unusual luxuriance at once attracting special notice. It was evergreen and of extraordinary size, extending in graceful festoons fully 100 feet on either side. We were told that at the time of the occupation of Saltillo by Taylor's army, this same vine was an attractive feature of the court. Imagine the dismay and apprehension of several American women at thus finding themselves surrounded by so many evidences of ancient refinement and culture, and yet by none of the modern necessaries of housekeeping. In this old city of 20,000 inhabitants, there was not a store where such indispensables as bedsteads or furniture of any kind, pillows or mattresses could be purchased, while coffee or spice mills, cook stoves or wash tubs were absolutely out of the question. How we managed may prove interesting to those who contemplate taking up their residence in Mexico, and will be related in the succeeding chapters. It was not by any means a question of money or price that prevented one from being comfortable at the outset. The dearth of household furniture and conveniences already mentioned put ingenuity and will force to their utmost tension, and I felt as if transported to antediluvian days. I have a candid conviction that Mother Noah never had cooking utensils more crude or a larder more scant than were mine. It may be, however, that the old man was good to help around the house. This was before the time of railways in Mexico, the Nacional Mexicano having only penetrated a few leagues west of the Rio Grande. With the primitive modes of transportation which served in lieu of the railway, it was not advisable to attempt bringing household goods so far over a trackless country. The inconveniences that followed were not peculiar to ourselves, but common to all strangers, who, like us, could neither anticipate nor realize the scarcity of every household appurtenance. The natives who enjoyed the luxury of furniture, and there was a large number who had everything in elegance, had also the romantic recollection that great two-wheeled carts, towering almost above the housetops, had brought it from the capital, nearly 1,000 miles, or it was manufactured by the carpenters of the town. In the division of the apartments of the house, one half was allotted to us, while our friends distributed themselves among the remaining rooms on the opposite side of the courtyard, the drawing room being used in common. Mr. and Mrs. R. employed a cook and had their own cuisine. The others flitted about from fonda to fonda (restaurant) in search of sustenance. In the evening of each day we would meet and compare notes on the varied and amusing experiences of the day. However, I am not relating the adventures of our friends, but will generously leave that happy task to them. Progress in furnishing our quarters in this great massive structure was slow indeed. How I longed for the delightful furnishings of my own home, which remained just as I had left it. Fortunately for us, a druggist had 2 spare pine single bedsteads, which he kindly sold to us for the sum of $40. At an American factory they would have been worth about $4 each. One was painted a bright red, the other an uncompromising orange. They were cot-like and had flat wire springs, while Mexican blankets constituted the entire bedding, mattresses and all. Pillows were improvised from bundles of wearing apparel. Fancy how they looked, the only furniture in a gorgeously frescoed room, 25 by 35 feet, and of proportionate height. Mr. and Mrs. R. were much less fortunate than ourselves in procuring their household comforts, or rather discomforts. They ordered 2 cots, which were covered with a gaily striped stuff. The brilliant dyes having impaired the strength of the material, at the first attempt to lie upon these treacherous beds, both individuals found themselves suddenly precipitated upon the stone floor. No one in the house had anything in the way of bedding to lend them, and in the darkness they betook themselves to the hotel. to occupy beds of iron, proof against collapse. A friend lent us 6 haircloth chairs and a table which had many years before been the operating table of his brother, a surgeon. It was long, green, and sagged in the middle. A carpenter was employed to make the remaining necessary articles of furniture. He labored on the customary manana system, and while his calculations as to time ranged all the way from 8 to 15 days, I found he actually meant from 6 weeks to 3 months. He showed samples of his workmanship, rocking chairs with and without arms, made of pine, stained or painted or varnished, and upright chairs with cane seats. I ventured to ask when he could complete for us a dozen chairs, 4 rockers, and some tables. Utterly amazed, he looked at me with a smile of incredulity, as if to say, "What can you do with so much furniture?" He disapproved of my wish to have oblong and round tables, so I yielded acquiescence to the customary triangular ones which grace the corners of every parlor of respectability. It now becomes necessary to introduce what proved to me the most peculiar and interesting feature of home life in Mexico. This is not an article of furniture, a fresco, a pounded earthen floor, or a bureau or barred casement, but the indispensable, all-pervading, and incomparable manservant known as the mozo. According to the prevailing idea, he is far more important than any of the things enumerated in my household menage, for from first to last he played a conspicuous role. Forewarned, forearmed, the respectability of the household depending on his presence, one was engaged, the strongest character in his line, the never-to-be-forgotten Pancho. It was perhaps not just a sentence to pronounce upon this individual, but circumstances seemed to warrant the comparison I involuntarily made between our watchful Pancho and a sleepless bloodhound. At night he curled himself up on a simple petate with no pillow and only a blanket, and was as ready to respond to our beck and call as in the day. In this house were 2 kitchens, representative of that part of the country. In the center of one was a miniature circus ring, about 3 feet in circumference, consisting simply of a raised circle of clay about 1 foot high. This constituted the range. Little fires were built within this ring, one under each of the pottery vessels used in the operations. After this uncomfortable fashion, the cooking was done, the smoke circling about at its own sweet will, and at length finding vent through a small door at one side, the only opening in the room. The sole piece of furniture was a worm-eaten table supported on 2 legs, the inner side braced against the wall. Its decayed condition indicated that it was at least 100 years old. Mrs. R. amused herself by experimenting on the circus ring, minus the aid of horses, however, a docile native woman executing what ground and lofty tumbling might be required in the culinary preparations. The second kitchen contained another style of range, equally primitive in its design. Along the wall was built a solid breastwork of adobe, about 2 feet high, 2 feet deep, and extending the entire length of the room. An opening was left in the roof above this structure for the escape of smoke, but the grimy walls proved that it failed to answer its purpose. Upon this ledge, projection, or whatever it may be termed, the cook places her various pottery vessels, with fires made of charcoal or small bits of wood under each, and there the stewing, boiling, frying, and crying go on all day. This cook, unlike the one in kitchen number 1, stands up in the performance of her duties. When I inspected these kitchens, it may be imagined that the sight was rather depressing, coupled with the certainty that I could effect no improvement. But we had the luxury of one tiny fireplace, to which in my despair I fled for refuge. In this little treasure our scheme of housekeeping was inaugurated, with results both brave and gay. Among the latter experiences I may class my first coffee roasting, not realizing till then that the essential feature of a mill was lacking, and that I was at least 500 miles from any possible purchase of one. Pancho, however, was equal to the emergency, and going off, soon returned with a metate. It was a decidedly primitive affair, and like the mills of the gods it ground slowly, but like them it also ground to powder. The metate is cut from a porous volcanic rock, and is about 18 inches long by a foot in width and 8 inches in thickness. The upper surface, which is generally a little concave, is roughened with indentures. Upon this the article is placed and beaten with another stone called a mano, resembling a rolling pin. Almost every article of food is passed between these stones: meat, vegetables, corn, coffee, spices, chocolate, even the salt, after being washed and sun-dried, is crushed upon it. Such a luxury as table salt was not to be had. Previous to use, these stones are hardened by being placed in the fire. The rough points become as firm as steel, and one metate will last through a generation. This necessity of everyday life was a revelation to me. The color of an elephant, it was quite as unwieldy and graceless, but its importance in the homely details of the menage was undeniable. It had but two competitors to divide the honors with: the maguey plant and the donkey. They were all three necessary to each other and to the commonwealth at large. Equipped with an inconceivable amount of pottery of every shape and kind, maguey brushes, fans of plaited palm, the national bellows, wood forks, spoons, and many other nameless primitive articles, my collection of household gods was complete. The first meal cooked in that dainty little fireplace was more delicious than any that could be furnished at Delmonico's. In his quaint efforts to assist, Pancho perambulated about with an air as all-important as though he were the chef of that famous cafe. But the climax of all was reached in Pancho's estimation when I put a pure white linen cloth on my green historic table and arranged for the meal. He said over and over, "Muy bonita cena," very pretty supper. But I discovered it was the attractions of my silver knives and forks and other natty tableware from home that constituted the novelty. In his experience, fingers were made before knives and forks. I found my major domo knew everything and everybody, the name of every street, the price of every article to be bought or sold. My curiosity, I presume, only stimulated his imagination, and the more pleased I appeared at his recitals, the more marvelous were his tales. He gave the lineage of every family of the gente decente for generations, his unique style adding pith and point to his narrations. He told me the story of Hidalgo and Morelos and Iturbide, the coming of the Americans, the French intervention, and all the late revolutions, until my head rang with the boom of cannon and the beat of drum. But invariably these poetic narratives were rudely interrupted by some over-practical intrusion. In the same breath in which he completed the recital of the Emperor Iturbide, he suggested that wood was better and cheaper than charcoal for cooking. With my approbation, he went to the plaza, returning in a little while with a man who brought 10 donkeys, all laden with wood, packed on like saddle-bags. I asked the wood vender to drive his vicious-looking dog out, when he complied by saying, Hist, Saul. Of course, I then thought the dog's name was Saul, but found the word meant get out. As the dog howled on being railed at, the man of importance again yelled at him, Cállate, cállate, el hocico, Coelho. Shut up, shut your mouth, and get out. Constant surprises were developed before my eyes every hour in the day. The yolks of the first eggs I bought were white. Indeed, this was often the case, which for a moment dazed me, as I had never expected to find my old friend the hen so different in her habits from her sisters in the States. But the qualities of the egg were identical with those familiar to me. However, yielding to prejudice, I rejoiced that eggs were not numbered among my favorite edibles. The difficulties of all strangers not familiar with the language and idioms of the country were a part of my daily experience. Pancho was by that time master of the situation, and although evidently often amused, his thoughtfulness in relieving me of all embarrassment never failed. Though grave, he had a sense of humor. This was made evident on one occasion when I had been using a hot flat iron. Having finished, I told Pancho to put it in the cocinera, meaning the kitchen. I heard a low chattering and smothered laughter between him and the cook. Pancho then returned to my room and half quizzically, half serio-comically said, Please come to the kitchen. I went, when he placed himself in front of the cook with his left hand on her shoulder, waved his right arm around the room and said, Señora, look, this is the cocinera, cook, and this, again waving the right hand around the room, is the cocina. Do you want me to put the plancha caliente, hot iron, in the cook or in the kitchen? Then, with the forefinger of his right hand moving hastily before his nose, and a waggish smile on his face, the pantomime closed with, No usamos así. We don't use them this way. Another ridiculous mistake I made when I wanted Pancho to buy me some cake and told him to get 4 gateaux, forgetting that bizcocho and not gateau was the Spanish for cake. Folding his arms, he quietly answered, without a smile, if he might presume to ask the señora what she wanted with 4 gatos, 4 cats, as the house was already overrun with these animals that had flocked in from all quarters. Pancho naturally wondered why I wanted to add to my feline tenants. Itinerant vendors of every imaginable commodity were constantly passing, and nothing pleased me better than to hold conversations with them, which they too evidently enjoyed. Soon after the episode of the flat iron, I heard the long-drawn intonation of a vendor and paid little heed to him, supposing he was running off a list of his stock in trade, such as pins, needles, tape, thread, and other things too numerous to mention. Wanting none of these, I replied, Tenemos bastante adentro. We have plenty in the house. A roar of laughter nearby, and a familiar voice interpreted the man's question humorously enough. He was only asking if I wanted a chichi, wet nurse. The common people of all ages were always bringing me regalitos, tokens of goodwill, and these were of every conceivable variety. A little girl whom I had often fed through the window came into the house with her rebozo drawn closely about her, saying she had a regalito for me. I supposed it to be fruit or flowers, and so motioned to her to put it on the table in the dining room. In a moment she was at my side, saying, No quedarse allí, it will not stay there, and going out I found a young chicken running around. To pay 50 cents for every donkey load of wood, as I had done, seemed preposterous, and as Pancho knew everything, I asked him to suggest some more economical system of purchase. He recommended watching for the carretas at 5 o'clock in the morning. Promptly at the hour indicated I was before the barred window, when I heard the awful screech, thump, bump, and rumble of the lumbering carretas. About a dozen in a line, they advanced slowly, their great old wooden wheels wobbling from side to side, drawn by oxen with rawhide trappings, their sturdy drivers sandal-footed and clothed in cotton cloth, with an iron-tipped goad in hand, punching and pushing the beasts at every step. Here was the wood, the entire tree, roots and all, ghosts of the forest, hauled 25 miles, rolling down the street on an antiquated vehicle. In response to Pancho's handclap, the manager of the caravan demanded $15 a load, the dollars being the only part of the transaction that belonged to our age. But the wood was duly bought. Pancho had so far held the reins as to all household purchases, but in accordance with my ideas of independence and careful management, I announced that I was going to market. He kindly told me that it was not customary for ladies to go to market. The mozo did that, throwing in so many arguments, also of a traditional nature, that I was somewhat awed by them, though not deterred. Having been accustomed to superintend personally all domestic duties, to be bolted and barred up in a house without recreation and outdoor exercise induced an insupportable sense of oppression. Walking leisurely along the street, absorbed in thought, with Pancho near at hand, carrying a basket, I was attracted by the sound of voices and the tramp of feet. Glancing backward, I saw a motley procession of idlers of the lower classes following, which increased at every corner, reminding me of the good old circus days, though without the blare of brass trumpets, the small boys bringing up the rear. The very unusual occurrence of a lady going to market had excited their curiosity. The market was a large pavilion-like building, occupying the center of a spacious plaza. Little tables and bits of straw matting were distributed on all sides, and upon these the tradespeople, chiefly women, displayed their wares, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and other commodities. On seeing me, every vendor began shouting the prices and names of articles, entreating the Señora Extranjera to buy. But the strange medley, together with their earnestness, took my breath away, and I could only stand and watch the crowd. In the fantastic scene before me, it would be impossible to tell which of the many unaccustomed features took precedence of the others in point of novelty. Notwithstanding the crowd, there was no disorder, no loud laughter or unseemly conduct. The courteous meetings between acquaintances, the quiet handshakings, the tender inquiry as to the health of each other, the many forms of polite greeting, were strangely at variance with their dilapidated and tattered condition, their soiled garments, half-faded blankets, and time-stained sombreros. Whole families seemed to have their abiding places in the market. Babies, babies everywhere, under the tables, on mats, hanging on their mothers' backs, cuddled up in heaps among the beets, turnips, and lettuces, peeping over pumpkins larger than they, rollicking, crying, crowing, and laughing, their dancing black eyes the only clean, clear spots about them, with and without clothes, until my head and the air were vocalizing the old-time ditty of "One little, two little, three little Injuns," but instead of stopping at 10, they bade fair to run up into the thousands. Parrots were there by the dozen. On seeing me, some began screaming and calling in idiomatic Spanish, "Look at the Señora Extranjera! Look! Look! Señorita, tell me your name!" The rest joined in chorus, and soon an interested crowd surrounded me. They kept close at my heels, inspecting every article I bought, even commenting on my dress, the women lightly stroking it and asking me 1,000 questions as to where I came from, how I liked their country, and if I was not afraid of the Mexicans, and invariably closing by saying, "She is far from her home. It is sad for her here." Here and there the amusing spectacle presented itself of men intently engaged in the occupation among us assigned to women, that of knitting and crocheting baby hoods and stockings of bright wool and of the funniest shapes I ever beheld. Vegetables, fruits, and nuts of all kinds were counted out carefully in little heaps, and could only be bought in that way by retail, wholesale rates being universally rejected. I could buy as many of these piles as I wanted, but each one was counted separately and paid for in the same way. I offered to buy out the entire outfit of a woman who had a bushel basket in reserve, even agreeing to pay her for the basket, but she only shook her head and wagged the forefinger, saying, "No, señora, no puedo." "No, madam, I cannot." A woman held in her hand a corn husk, which she waved continuously up and down. On examination I found it was butter, rolled up snugly, which she assured me was fresca sin sal, fresh without salt. A new revelation, but in the course of time I learned to appreciate this primitive method, and that in this climate salt was a hindrance to its preservation for any length of time. At last I became convinced of the perfect and complete fitness of things and of their self-vindication. From Pancho's manner I am sure he felt as if his vocation were gone by the way I had overleaped the bounds of custom in finding out things for myself. Nevertheless, he managed now and then to give some of the vendors an account of our house, its location, and my singular management. But though looking mystified, he never left me for a moment, no matter how long I talked or asked explanations. We went into the stores, Pancho keeping between me and the crowd. The shopkeepers were as much surprised and as curious as the people in the streets to see me marketing. But when the crowd of idlers closed up around me, they were polite and solicitous to know if the procession annoyed me. The arrangement of the merchandise and the method of trafficking elicited an involuntary smile from me at every turn, so if the merchants, clerks, and the procession found fun at my expense, I was no less amused at theirs. Dozens of mozos bought from them in my presence a tablespoon of lard, which the agile clerk placed on a bit of brown paper for transportation, 3 or 4 lumps of sugar, a tlacos worth of salt, the same of pepper, were all taken from immense piles of these articles near at hand, wrapped and ready for the purchaser. Dainty china teacups hung closely together by their handles on the edge of every shelf and up and down the walls in unbroken lines, but not a saucer was in sight, nor could a dish be had at any price. Anticipating that I would take a tlaco, medio, and real's worth, like the mozos, the clerk took in his nimble fingers a few of the little packages, but my extraordinary announcement despoiled him of his ordinary sales. Every eye was upon me when I had the temerity to ask for 20 pounds of sugar, 10 pounds of coffee, and a gallon of vinegar. Sugar and coffee were abundant, but the vinegar was in bottles. He handed me one with a flourish, saying, "Vinagre de Francia. We have no other." I began to feel that far-away France had become my ally, having, like me, made an invasion on the costumbres. The only difference being that the vinegar bottles were jolted on the backs of meek burros or in carts 1,000 miles, and I had arrived safe and sound by diligence. I asked, "Have you ham?" "No hay. There is none." "Pickles?" "No hay." "Powdered sugar?" "No hay." "Crackers?" "Tampoco. Neither." "Salt?" "Si hay. Yes, there is some." "Coffee?" "Si hay." "Frijoles? Beans?" "Tambien." "Candles?" "Si hay." "Potatoes?" "Ya no hay. Se acabaron." They are finished, all gone. Going to market, a matter-of-fact affair in the United States, resolved itself into a novel adventure. The heterogeneous assemblage of goods and the natural and artificial products of the country astonished me equally with the strange vendors. there was so much that was at once humorous, pitiable, and grotesque, all of which was heightened when I reached home and observed quite a number of the procession in the rear. Once over the threshold, Pancho slammed the door in their faces, saying, "Son pobres todos y sin vergüenzas." They are all poor and without shame. Every day the strange enigma unfolded itself before me with a crude interest. My lot had been cast among these people when in total ignorance of their habits and customs. My aim and purpose above all things was to establish a home among them on the basis of the one left behind. The sequel will show how well I succeeded. End of an 1880s sojourn in Saltillo, Mexico, from Face to Face with the Mexicans by Fanny Chambers Gooch, 1887. Read for LibriVox by Sue Anderson.
Tabloid Drama by Sidney Howard from the November 1921 Bookman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Berard. Tabloid Drama by Sidney Howard. Certainly, there is no criticism so satisfactory to write as that of an anthology of plays. It accords the critic the privilege of revamping the original without any of the cruel labor of proportionate selection. Can it be, he says, that such a gem as Deirdre's Dugout is omitted when blank, not to speak of blank, is included? And the anthologist cringes. Though I confess to an irrational dislike of the one-act play as a form, and to a red-blooded prejudice against any little theatre, here is a book and an anthology with which I have no quarrel. It has unquestioned value. The list of 50 authors is catholic in extent and varied in style, and affords the usual opportunities for comparisons between techniques. The gathering of so many short plays within the scope of a single volume saves time and room. The plays are followed by what seems to me an excellent and inclusive bibliography. Many old friends are here: the erotic bully von Hofmannsthal, Schnitzler, and Maeterlinck making imaginary faces at one another, Wedekind with the tenor, a group of familiar Englishmen, the priceless Lady Gregory, Giacosa, Andreyev, little better than he should be, and Chekhov with his masterly miniature, The Boor. Very few members of the League of Nations suffer from the discrimination of the anthologists, and the balance of power is tactfully and overwhelmingly assigned to the dramatists of God's country. Two absentees are to be noted. There is no specimen of the sonorous vacuum of Lord Dunsany's art, and none of Shaw's admirable one-act dissertations has been included. Dunsany is a small loss, and Shaw, among other one-act dramatists, is out of the picture. The volume does admirably, should be a happy hunting ground of little theatre managers and an amateur's Eldorado. From the introduction, by Mr. Loving, I cull one phrase: a younger generation of dramatists, which is achieving its most notable work outside the beaten path of popular recognition, in small dramatic juntos and in the little theatres. This is the description accorded by the book to the American group whose plays it publishes. One wonders. I am inclined to fall back, for the moment, upon Brander Matthews' old distinction between the short story and the story which is merely short. Perhaps that is my quarrel with the one-act play, that it has the same limitations as a short story, the situation which begins in the middle develops no character, and ends too soon with a punch in the last line. Art demands leisure, dramatic art no less than any other. 3 hours is none too long, 30 minutes is wretchedly scant. Of all the notable work achieved outside the beaten path of popular recognition, and herein reproduced, one play seems to me to emerge. I, by Eugene O'Neill. I should have liked that better as a Saturday Evening Post story than as a one-act play. Plays which are short, like Wilde's Salome and Shaw's The Man of Destiny, in which the episode developed takes account of the characters concerned, are very different things from these over-concise trifles and horrors, which seem so easy to write and so little worth the writing. The introduction closes with a conventional picture of a new theatre, perfectly equipped, plastic, and infinitely adaptable, in which Arthur Hopkins, John Williams, Winthrop Ames, Sam Hume, and George Cram Cook are to be allowed to run riot. The picture has charm, and there would be no doubt of the risk. Review of 50 Contemporary One-Act Plays, edited by Frank Shea and Pierre Loving, Stewart and Kidd Company. End of Tabloid Drama by Sidney Howard.
On May 9, 1753, in a letter written by Pennsylvania's most famous resident to Peter Collinson, Fellow of the Royal Society in London, Benjamin Franklin gave full vent to his frustration on the topics of welfare and immigration in the American colonies. This is one of Franklin's most important letters, now available through the National Archives and online at founders.archives.gov. In it are discussed welfare relief and its psychological effects on recipients, and the difficulties of assimilation of German immigrants into colonial America. While at least 5 versions of this letter exist, this copy from the Hardwick Papers in the New York Public Library is considered the fullest surviving version. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in November 2016. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer on the LibriVox project, please visit LibriVox.org. Philadelphia, May 9, 1753. To Peter Collinson. Sir, I received your favor of the 29th August last, and thank you for the kind and judicious remarks you have made on my little piece, Observations on the Increase of Mankind. Whatever further occurs to you on the same subject, you will much oblige me in communicating it. I have often observed with wonder that temper of the poor English manufacturers and day laborers which you mention, and acknowledge it to be pretty general. When any of them happen to come here, where labor is much better paid than in England, their industry seems to diminish in equal proportion. But it is not so with the German laborers. They retain the habitual industry and frugality they bring with them, and now receiving higher wages, an accumulation arises that makes them all rich. When I consider that the English are the offspring of Germans, that the climate they live in is much of the same temperature, when I can see nothing in nature that should create this difference, I am apt to suspect it must arise from institution. And I have sometimes doubted whether the laws peculiar to England, which compel the rich to maintain the poor, have not given the latter a dependence that very much lessens the care of providing against the wants of old age. I have heard it remarked that the poor in Protestant countries on the continent of Europe are generally more industrious than those of popish countries. May not the more numerous foundations in the latter for the relief of the poor have some effect towards rendering them less provident? To relieve the misfortunes of our fellow creatures is concurring with the Deity. 'Tis godlike. But if we provide encouragements for laziness and supports for folly, may it not be found fighting against the order of God and nature, which perhaps has appointed want and misery as the proper punishments for, and cautions against, as well as necessary consequences of, idleness and extravagancy? When we attempt to mend the scheme of Providence and to interfere in the government of the world, we had need be very circumspect, lest we do more harm than good. In New England they once thought blackbirds useless and mischievous to their corn. They made laws to destroy them. The consequence was the blackbirds were diminished, but the kind of worms which devoured their grass, and which the blackbirds had been used to feed on, increased prodigiously. Then, finding their loss in grass much greater than their saving in corn, they wished again for their blackbirds. We had here some years since a Transylvanian Tartar, Samuel Domine, a Romanian priest, who had travelled much in the East, and came hither merely to see the West, intending to go home through the Spanish West Indies, China, and etc. He asked me one day what I thought might be the reason that so many and such numerous nations as the Tartars in Europe and Asia, the Indians in America, and the Negroes in Africa continued a wandering, careless life, and refused to live in cities and to cultivate the arts they saw practiced by the civilized part of mankind. While I was considering what answer to make him, "I'll tell you," says he in his broken English, "God make man for paradise. He make him for to live lazy. Man make God angry. God turn him out of paradise and bid him work. Man no love work. He want to go to paradise again. He want to live lazy. So all mankind love lazy." Howe'er it may be, it seems certain that the hope of becoming at some time of life free from the necessity of care and labor, together with fear of penury, are the mainsprings of most people's industry. To those, indeed, who have been educated in elegant plenty, even the provision made for the poor may appear misery, but to those who have scarce ever been better provided for, such provision may seem quite good and sufficient. These latter have then nothing to fear worse than their present conditions, and scarce hope for anything better than a parish maintenance, so that there is only the difficulty of getting that maintenance allowed while they are able to work, or a little shame they suppose attending it, that can induce them to work at all, and what they do will only be from hand to mouth. The proneness of human nature to a life of ease, of freedom from care and labor, appears strongly in the little success that has hitherto attended every attempt to civilize our American Indians. In their present way of living, almost all their wants are supplied by the spontaneous productions of nature, with the addition of very little labor. If hunting and fishing may indeed be called labor, when game is so plenty, they visit us frequently, and see the advantages that arts, sciences, and compact society procure us. They are not deficient in natural understanding, and yet they have never shown any inclination to change their manner of life for ours, or to learn any of our arts. When an Indian child has been brought up among us, taught our language, and habituated to our customs, yet if he goes to see his relations and make one Indian ramble with them, there is no persuading him ever to return. And that this is not natural to them, merely as Indians, but as men, is plain from this, that when white persons of either sex have been taken prisoners young by the Indians, and lived a while among them, though ransomed by their friends, and treated with all imaginable tenderness to prevail with them to stay among the English, yet in a short time they become disgusted with our manner of life, and the care and pains that are necessary to support it, and take the first good opportunity of escaping again into the woods, from whence there is no reclaiming them. One instance I remember to have heard, where the person was brought home to possess a good estate, but finding some care necessary to keep it together, he relinquished it to a younger brother, reserving to himself nothing but a gun and a match-coat, with which he took his way again into the wilderness. Though they have few but natural wants, and those easily supplied, with us are infinite artificial wants, no less craving than those of nature, and much more difficult to satisfy, so that I am apt to imagine that close societies subsisting by labor and arts arose first not from choice but from necessity. When numbers being driven by war from their hunting grounds and prevented by seas or by other nations were crowded together into some narrow territories which without labor would not afford them food. However, as matters now stand with us, care and industry seem absolutely necessary to our well-being. They should, therefore, have every encouragement we can invent, and not one motive to diligence be subtracted, and the support of the poor should not be maintaining them in idleness, but by employing them in some kind of labor suited to their abilities of body, and etc., as I am informed of late begins to be the practice in many parts of England, where workhouses are erected for that purpose. If these were general, I should think the poor would be more careful and work voluntarily and lay up something for themselves against a rainy day, rather than run the risk of being obliged to work at the pleasure of others for a bare subsistence, and that too under confinement. The little value Indians set on what we prize so highly under the name of learning appears from a pleasant passage that happened some years since at a treaty between one of our colonies and the Six Nations. When everything had been settled to the satisfaction of both sides, and nothing remained but a mutual exchange of civilities, the English commissioners told the Indians that they had in their country a college for the instruction of youth who were there taught various languages, arts, and sciences, that there was a particular foundation in favor of the Indians to defray the expense of the education of any of their sons who should desire to take the benefit of it. And now, if the Indians would accept the offer, the English would take half a dozen of their brightest lads and bring them up in the best manner. The Indians, after consulting on the proposal, replied that it was remembered some of their youths had formerly been educated in that college, but it had been observed that for a long time after they returned to their friends they were absolutely good for nothing, being neither acquainted with the true methods of killing deer, catching beaver, or surprising an enemy. The proposition, however, they looked on as a mark of the kindness and goodwill of the English to the Indian nations, which merited a grateful return, and therefore, if the English gentlemen would send a dozen or two of their children to Onondaga, the Great Council would take care of their education, bring them up in really what was the best manner, and make men of them. I am perfectly of your mind that measures of great temper are necessary with the Germans, and am not without apprehensions that through their indiscretion or ours, or both, great disorders and inconveniences may one day arise among us. Those who come hither are generally of the most ignorant, stupid sort of their own nation, and as ignorance is often attended with credulity when knavery would mislead it, and with suspicion when honesty would set it right, and as few of the English understand the German language, and so cannot address them either from the press or the pulpit, 'tis almost impossible to remove any prejudices they once entertain. Their own clergy have very little influence over the people, who seem to take an uncommon pleasure in abusing and discharging the minister on every trivial occasion. Not being used to liberty, they know not how to make a modest use of it, and as Colbin says of the young Hottentots, in his The Present State of the Cape of Good Hope, that they are not esteemed men till they have shown their manhood by beating their mothers, so these seem to think themselves not free till they can feel their liberty in abusing and insulting their teachers. Thus they are under no restraint of ecclesiastical government. They behave, however, submissively enough at present to the civil government, which I wish they may continue to do. For I remember when they modestly declined intermeddling in our elections, but now they come in droves, and carry all before them, except in 1 or 2 counties. Few of their children in the country learn English. They import many books from Germany, and of the 6 printing houses in the province, 2 are entirely German, 2 half German, half English, and but 2 entirely English. They have 1 German newspaper, and 1 half German. Advertisements intended to be general are now printed in Dutch and English. The signs in our streets have inscriptions in both languages, and in some places only German. They begin of late to make all their bonds and other legal writings in their own language, which, though I think it ought not to be, are allowed good in our courts, where the German business so increases that there is continual need of interpreters. And I suppose in a few years they will be also necessary in the assembly to tell one half of our legislators what the other half say. In short, unless the stream of their importation could be turned from this to other colonies, as you very judiciously propose, they will soon so outnumber us that all the advantages we have will not, in my opinion, be able to preserve our language, and even our government will become precarious. The French, who watch all advantages, are now themselves making a German settlement back of us in the Illinois country, and by means of those Germans they may in time come to an understanding with ours, and indeed in the last war our Germans showed a general disposition that seems to bode us no good. For when the English, who were not Quakers, alarmed by the danger arising from the defenseless state of our country, entered unanimously into an association within this government and the lower counties, raised, armed, and disciplined near 10,000 men, the Germans, except a very few in proportion to their numbers, refused to engage in it, giving out one among another, and even in print, that if they were quiet, the French, should they take the country, would not molest them, at the same time abusing the Philadelphians for fitting out privateers against the enemy, and representing the trouble, hazard, and expense of defending the province as a greater inconvenience than any that might be expected from a change of government. Yet I am not for refusing entirely to admit them into our colonies. All that seems to be necessary is to distribute them more equally, mix them with the English, establish English schools where they are now too thickly settled, and take some care to prevent the practice lately fallen into by some of the ship owners of sweeping the German gulls to make up the number of their passengers. I say I am not against the admission of Germans in general, for they have their virtues. Their industry and frugality is exemplary. They are excellent husbandmen and contribute greatly to the improvement of a country. I pray God long to preserve to Great Britain the English laws, manners, liberties, and religion, notwithstanding the complaints so frequent in your public papers of the prevailing corruption and degeneracy of your people. I know you have a great deal of virtue still subsisting among you, and I hope the Constitution is not so near a dissolution as some seem to apprehend. I do not think you are generally become such slaves to your vices as to draw down that justice Milton speaks of when he says that, quote, sometimes nations will descend so low from reason, which is virtue, that no wrong but justice and some fatal curse annexed deprives them of their outward liberty, their inward lost. Footnote, paraphrased from Paradise Lost, Book 12, lines 97 through 101. In history we find that piety, public spirit, and military prowess have their flows as well as their ebbs in every nation, and that the tide is never so low but it may rise again. But should this dreaded fatal change happen in my time, how should I, even in the midst of the affliction, rejoice? If we have been able to preserve those invaluable treasures, and can invite the good among you to come and partake of them. Oh, let not Britain seek to oppress us, but like an affectionate parent endeavor to secure freedom to her children, that they may be able to assist her one day in defending her own, whereas a mortification begun in the foot may spread upwards to the destruction of the nobler parts of the body. I fear I have already extended this rambling letter beyond your patience, and therefore conclude with requesting your acceptance of the enclosed pamphlet, from Sir, your most humble servant, B. Franklin. End of the letter from Benjamin Franklin to Peter Collinson, 9th of May, 1753.
Weymouth New Testament in Modern Speech. James. By R. F. Weymouth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Berard. Weymouth New Testament in Modern Speech. James. By R. F. Weymouth. Book 59. James. James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are scattered over the world, all good wishes. Reckon it nothing but joy, my brethren, whenever you find yourselves hedged in by various trials. Be assured that the testing of your faith leads to power of endurance. Only let endurance have perfect results, so that you may become perfect and complete, deficient in nothing. And if any one of you is deficient in wisdom, let him ask God for it, who gives with open hand to all men, and without upbraiding, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith, and have no doubts, for he who has doubts is like the surge of the sea, driven by the wind and tossed into spray. A person of that sort must not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a one is a man of 2 minds, undecided in every step he takes. Let a brother in humble life rejoice when raised to a higher position, but a rich man should rejoice in being brought low. For like flowers among the herbage, rich men will pass away. The sun rises with his scorching heat and dries up the herbage, so that its flowers drop off, and the beauty of its appearance perishes, and in the same way rich men with all their prosperity will fade away. Blessed is he who patiently endures trials, for when he has stood the test, he will gain the victor's crown, even the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when passing through trial, "My temptation is from God." For God is incapable of being tempted to do evil, and he himself tempts no one. But when a man is tempted, it is his own passions that carry him away and serve as a bait. Then the passion conceives and becomes the parent of sin, and sin, when fully matured, gives birth to death. Do not be deceived, my dearly loved brethren. Every gift which is good and every perfect boon is from above, and comes down from the Father, who is the source of all light. In him there is no variation nor the slightest suggestion of change. In accordance with his will, he made us, his children, through the message of the truth, so that we might, in a sense, be the first fruits of things which he has created. You know this, my dearly loved brethren. But let every one be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to be angry. For a man's anger does not lead to action which God regards as righteous. Ridding yourselves, therefore, of all that is vile and of the evil influences which prevail around you, welcome in a humble spirit the message implanted within you, which is able to save your souls. But prove yourselves obedient to the message, and do not be mere hearers of it, imposing a delusion upon yourselves. For if anyone listens but does not obey, he is like a man who carefully looks at his own face in a mirror. Although he has looked carefully at himself, he goes away and has immediately forgotten the sort of man he is. But he who looks closely into the perfect law, the law of freedom, and continues looking, he, being not a hearer who forgets, but an obedient doer, will, as the result of his obedience, be blessed. If a man thinks that he is scrupulously religious, although he is not curbing his tongue, but is deceiving himself, his religious service is worthless. The religious service which is pure and stainless in the sight of our God and Father is to visit fatherless children and widowed women in their time of trouble, and to keep one's own self unspotted from the world. My brethren, you must not make distinctions between one man and another, while you are striving to maintain faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, who is our glory. For suppose a man comes into one of your meetings wearing gold rings and fine clothes, and there also comes in a poor man wearing shabby clothes, and you pay court to the one who wears the fine clothes, and say, "Sit here, this is a good place," while to the poor man you say, "Stand there, or sit on the floor at my feet." Is it not plain that in your hearts you have little faith, seeing that you have become judges full of wrong thoughts? Listen, my dearly loved brethren. Has not God chosen those whom the world regards as poor to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to those that love him? But you have put dishonor upon the poor man. Yet is it not the rich who grind you down? Are not they the very people who drag you into the law courts? And the very people who speak evil of the noble name by which you are called? If, however, you are keeping the law as supreme, in obedience to the commandment which says, "You are to love your fellow man just as you love yourself," you are acting rightly. But if you are making distinctions between one man and another, you are guilty of sin, and are convicted by the law as offenders. A man who has kept the law as a whole, but has failed to keep some one command, has become guilty of violating all. For he who said, "Do not commit adultery," also said, "Do not commit murder." And if you are a murderer, although not an adulterer, you have become an offender against the law. Speak and act as those should who are expecting to be judged by the law of freedom. For he who shows no mercy will have judgment given against him without mercy, but mercy triumphs over judgment. What good is it, my brethren, if a man professes to have faith, and yet his actions do not correspond? Can such faith save him? Suppose a Christian brother or sister is poorly clad or lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, "I wish you well, keep yourselves warm and well fed," and yet you do not give them what they need. What is the use of that? So also faith, if it is unaccompanied by obedience, has no life in it, so long as it stands alone. Nay, some one will say, "You have faith, I have actions. Prove to me your faith apart from corresponding actions, and I will prove mine to you by my actions." You believe that God is one, and you are quite right. Evil spirits also believe this, and shudder. But, idle boaster, are you willing to be taught how it is that faith, apart from obedience, is worthless? Take the case of Abraham, our forefather. Was it, or was it not, because of his actions that he was declared to be righteous as the result of his having offered up his son Isaac upon the altar? You notice that his faith was cooperating with his actions, and that by his actions his faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, "And Abraham believed God, and his faith was placed to his credit as righteousness, and he received the name of God's friend." You all see that it is because of actions that a man is pronounced righteous, and not simply because of faith. In the same way also was not the notorious sinner Rahab declared to be righteous because of her actions when she welcomed the spies and hurriedly helped them to escape another way? For just as a human body without a spirit is lifeless, so also faith is lifeless if it is unaccompanied by obedience. Do not be eager, my brethren, for many among you to become teachers, for you know that we teachers shall undergo severer judgment. For we often stumble and fall, all of us. If there is any one who never stumbles in speech, that man has reached maturity of character and is able to curb his whole nature. Remember that we put the horse's bit into their mouths to make them obey us, and so we turn their whole bodies round. So too with ships, great as they are, and often driven along by strong gales, yet they can be steered with a very small rudder in whichever direction the caprice of the man at the helm chooses. In the same way the tongue is an insignificant part of the body, but it is immensely boastful. Remember how a mere spark may set a vast forest in flames. And the tongue is a fire, that world of iniquity. The tongue is placed within us, spotting and soiling our whole nature, and setting the whole round of our lives on fire, being itself set on fire by Gehenna. For brute nature under all its forms, beasts and birds, reptiles and fishes, can be subjected and kept in subjection by human nature. But the tongue no man or woman is able to tame. It is an ever busy mischief, and is full of deadly poison. With it we bless the Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who are made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth there proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, this ought not to be. In a fountain, are fresh water and bitter sent forth from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, yield olives, or a vine yield figs? No, and neither can salt water yield sweet. Which of you is a wise and well-instructed man? Let him prove it by a right life, with conduct guided by a wisely teachable spirit. But if in your hearts you have bitter feelings of envy and rivalry, do not speak boastfully and falsely, in defiance of the truth. That is not the wisdom which comes down from above. It belongs to earth, to the unspiritual nature, and to evil spirits. For where envy and rivalry are, there also are unrest and every vile deed. The wisdom from above is first of all pure, then peaceful, courteous, not self-willed, full of compassion and kind actions, free from favoritism and from all insincerity. And peace, for those who strive for peace, is the seed of which the harvest is righteousness. What causes wars and contentions among you? Is it not the cravings which are ever at war within you for various pleasures? You covet things and yet cannot get them. You commit murder. You have passionate desires and yet cannot gain your end. You begin to fight and make war. You have not, because you do not pray. Or you pray and yet do not receive, because you pray wrongly, your object being to waste what you get on some pleasure or another. You unfaithful women, do you not know that friendship with the world means enmity to God? Therefore, whoever is bent on being friendly with the world makes himself an enemy to God. Or do you suppose that it is to no purpose that the Scripture says, the Spirit which He has caused to dwell in our hearts yearns jealously over us? But He gives more abundant grace, as is implied in His saying, God sets Himself against the haughty, but to the lowly He gives grace. Submit therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and make your hearts pure, you who are half-hearted towards God. Afflict yourselves, and mourn and weep aloud. Let your laughter be turned into grief, and your gladness into shame. Humble yourselves in the presence of the Lord, and He will exalt you. Do not speak evil of one another, brethren. The man who speaks evil of a brother man, or judges his brother man, speaks evil of the law, and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are no longer one who obeys the law, but one who judges it. The only real lawgiver and judge is he who is able to save or to destroy. Who are you to sit in judgment on your fellow man? Come, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, and spend a year there, and carry on a successful business, when, all the while, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. For what is the nature of your life? Why, it is but a mist, which appears for a short time, and then is seen no more. Instead of that you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we shall live, and do this or that. But, as the case stands, it is in mere self-confidence that you boast. All such boasting is evil. If, however, a man knows what is right to do, and yet does not do it, he commits a sin. Come, you rich men, weep aloud and howl for your sorrows, which will soon be upon you. Your treasures have rotted, and your piles of clothing are moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver have become covered with rust, and the rust on them will give evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded up wealth in these last days. I tell you that the pay of the laborers who have gathered in your crops, pay which you are keeping back, is calling out against you, and the outcries of those who have been your reapers have entered into the ears of the Lord of the armies of heaven. Here on earth you have lived self-indulgent and profligate lives. You have stupefied yourselves with gross feeding, but a day of slaughter has come. You have condemned, you have murdered the righteous man. He offers no resistance. Be patient, therefore, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. Notice how eagerly a farmer waits for a valuable crop. He is patient over it till it has received the early and the later rain. So you also must be patient, keeping up your courage, for the coming of the Lord is now close at hand. Do not cry out in condemnation of one another, brethren, lest you come under judgment. I tell you that the judge is standing at the door. In illustration, brethren, of persecution patiently endured, take the prophets who have spoken as messengers from the Lord. Remember that we call those blessed who endured what they did. You have also heard of Job's patient endurance, and you have seen the issue of the Lord's dealings with him, how full of tenderness and pity the Lord is. But above all things, my brethren, do not swear, either by heaven or by the earth, or with any other oath. Let your yes be simply yes, and your no be simply no, that you may not come under condemnation. Is one of you suffering? Let him pray. Is any one in good spirits? Let him sing a song. Is any one ill? Let him send for the elders of the church, and let them pray over him, after anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith will restore the sick man, and the Lord will raise him up to health. And if he has committed sins, they shall be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to one another, and pray for one another, so that you may be cured. The heartfelt supplication of a righteous man exerts a mighty influence. Elijah was a man with a nature similar to ours, and he earnestly prayed that there might be no rain, and no rain fell on the land for 3 years and 6 months. Again he prayed, and the sky gave rain, and the land yielded its crops. My brethren, if one of you strays from the truth, and someone brings him back, let him know that he who brings a sinner back from his evil ways will save the man's soul from death and throw a veil over a multitude of sins. End of Weymouth New Testament in Modern Speech, James, by R. F. Weymouth.